Here's the chair's mic. Testing 1, 2. Remember, testing 1, 2. You got that one? All right. Testing 1, 2.
Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. The full committee hearing is convening to review the GAO 2019 high-risk report. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Good afternoon. Today, the committee is pleased to welcome Gene Dodaro, the Comptroller General of the United States and head of the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Dodaro is here to discuss GAO's high-risk report. GAO issues this report at the beginning of each Congress to highlight programs that are most vulnerable to waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. The high-risk report also recommends solutions to save taxpayer funds, improve public services, and hold our government accountable. Over the past 13 years, improvement to high-risk programs have saved us nearly $350 billion, or about $27 billion a year. Improving high-risk programs can have a very real effect on Americans' lives. If implemented correctly, this year's recommendations would improve the health care for veterans, protect Americans from toxic chemicals, make our food safer, help stem the deadly tide of opioid addiction, which we will be addressing tomorrow. And Mr. Dodaro, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I want to thank all the people that are here with you and those that are in your office for all the hard work that you do in a very nonpartisan way and the professionalism that you all bring to the job. We know that when you issue a report, you dot your I's, you cross your T's, and you give us information that is indeed usable. And so, on behalf of a grateful Congress, I thank you. Today, we will discuss many issues, and I'd like to highlight a few, and I want you to listen up, because this is important information. First, inaction on climate change. Perhaps the most concerning issue in this year's report relates to climate change. According to this report, the Trump administration, and I quote, I didn't say this, GAO said this, has not made measurable progress since 2017 to reduce its fiscal exposure to climate change, and in some cases has revoked prior policies designed to do so, end of quote. Instead of confronting this existential threat with science and ingenuity, the President is denying the threat, and the problem exists and it continues. He revoked President Obama's climate action plan and is now creating a new White House panel to counter the idea that burning fossil fuels is harming the planet. Inadequate strategy for cybersecurity. Today's report also warns that the Trump administration lacks a comprehensive strategy to address cybersecurity threats across the federal government. Inexplicably, the President eliminated the cybersecurity coordinator position at the White House last year. These are the facts, leaving our federal government without any White House leader devoted to protecting us with regard to cybersecurity. The GAO report calls on federal agencies to take, quote, urgent actions, end of quote, to address this threat which could affect our nation's most closely held secrets: our energy grid, our banks, our communication systems, and nearly every aspect of Americans' lives. Today's report also warns that the Trump administration, quote, has not established measures to ensure quality of background and investigations and adjudications, end of quote, for security clearances, and faces, listen to this one, and faces a current backlog of 565,000 security clearance applications. Let that sink in. Instead of fixing these problems, the President, unfortunately, has undermined the security clearance process. According to recent reports, he ignored the concerns of his own White House advisors, career national security officials, to give his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a security clearance. Today's report also highlights the risks facing the upcoming census, which is of special interest to our committee. The report highlights rising costs, hundreds of unresolved security weaknesses, a scaled-back testing under the Trump administration that, quote, increases the risk that innovations in IT systems will not function as intended during the 2020 census, end of quote. I didn't say that. GAO said it. Today's report also highlights the epidemic of drug addiction in this country, which is one of this committee's highest priorities. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 70,000 people, the number of people that will fit into Raven Stadium in my district, Americans died from drug overdoses in 2017. About 191 people die every day in this country. Yet the President had no national drug control strategy or White House drug czar for the past 2 years. GAO has identified this as a, quote, emerging issue requiring close attention, end of quote. We're holding a hearing on this topic tomorrow with the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and experts from GAO. Today's report provides a roadmap for improving our federal government. But GAO's recommendations can be turned to effective reforms only with the cooperation and leadership from the President and executive branch agencies. Unfortunately, President Trump and the White House have refused to even cooperate with GAO. Refused to even cooperate with them so they can get, I want you to talk about that because that's important. If we can't get information, we can't do our job. If we can't get information, we can't hold the executive branch accountable, which we have sworn to do, and which is mandated under the Constitution of the United States of America. Last year, GAO sent an extraordinary letter to the White House counsel expressing concern that White House officials, quote, listen to this, will not respond to inquiries or otherwise engage with GAO staff during the course of our reviews. The letter noted, and I quote, this approach represents a clear departure from past practice, end of quote. Nevertheless, the obstruction has continued. Last month, GAO issued a report finding the President spent $13.6 million of taxpayer money on trips to Mar-a-Lago. The White House refused to provide any information to assist with GAO's review. GAO is part of the legislative branch, and the White House refuses to cooperate with GAO's request is an insult to this Congress. We will be following up directly with the White House, of course, and I look forward to hearing today from Mr. DiDardo on each of these issues and many others. I also look forward to the continuing work to work closely with GAO and our colleagues to hold our federal government accountable to the American people. And with that, I yield to the distinguished ranking member of our committee, Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. DiDardo, good to see you again. You've been here numerous times over the years, and we appreciate your work and you taking the time to brief us today. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine government programs that the Government Accountability Office has determined as, quote, high risk. That is, programs that are faulty and risk substantial loss of taxpayer money. Substantial means at risk of losing at least a minimum of $1 billion. That certainly is a lot of money, but it is still an out-of-date figure. There are so many big government programs that now meet this threshold that GAO cannot solely rely on that criteria. This topic is at the core of this committee's mission. It is oversight of federal dollars and the examination of mismanagement by the government. As you have said before, Mr. Chairman, this committee should focus on issues that affect the American people every single day, not those that only serve to fill campaign war chests. What we have gathered here today is to discuss is just that, examples of waste, fraud, and abuse that affect everyday Americans. The list should be our marching orders. 35 examples of government inefficiency. Unfortunately, many of these are not new to us. 5 who have been included on the list since its conception in 1990. There's some agencies they got on and they have never got off. Overall, only 26 programs have ever been removed. Congressional oversight is a central theme to success, and congressional oversight has led to over $350 billion being saved over the last decade. It's not as if it is extremely difficult for a program to be removed from the list. GAO clearly outlines what needs to be done to achieve their objective, and this hearing should help us better understand these recommendations to ensure programs are removed. With hundreds of recommendations still open, it is clear that the convoluted and extensive bureaucracy accepts the status quo. Agencies in Congress must do better, and there is much to be done. Progress has been palpable since the new administration took office, especially at the Department of Defense. 2 DoD programs were removed, including one, supply chain management, that had been on the list since 1990. So there's one who made it. Been there forever in our Defense Department and now no longer on the high-risk list. Supply chain management is simply knowing how much stuff to buy and where it is. This has been an issue for 30 years. Removing this is an impressive step for this administration and will lead to safer, more secure, more efficient military. In the past 2 years, another 3 DoD programs have improved, and I'm encouraged by these improvements, but I'm also aware that this is just the beginning. Federal agencies continue to mismanage and waste money of hardworking Americans that we all get the privilege of representing. Finally, I look forward to our discussion today and continued progress, but I'd also point out that I think this is exactly what this committee is supposed to do. Even though we've taken government out of the name of the committee, we are supposed to provide oversight of government agencies. This goes to the heart and the soul and the core of what the Government Oversight Committee is supposed to be doing. So, Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for having us here today, and Mr. DiDardo for your testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now I want to welcome the Honorable Gene DiDardo, and I want to thank him again for participating in today's hearing. Comptroller General DiDardo, if you and your staff would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. You may be seated. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I want to thank you very much. The microphones are sensitive, so please speak directly into them. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. With that, Comptroller General DiDardo, You are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to you, Ranking Member Congressman Jordan, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss the latest update to GAO's high-risk list. This high-risk program continues to be a valuable congressional tool for oversight and produces tangible benefits for the American people, as both Mr. Chairman, you and Ranking Member Jordan outlined in your opening statements. I'm pleased to report that of the 35 areas, 7 have made progress since our last update in 2017. 4 of the 7, Congressman Jordan, were DOD areas. I'm pleased with the management team over there. They're doing a good job addressing some of these issues. 2 have progressed far enough for us to take them off the list. DOD supply chain management, and as a result of improvements, there are millions of dollars being saved now in inventory management, asset visibility, and material distribution. And it's improved DOD's ability to carry out its mission because it needs to have the supplies at the right time, at the right place to do a good job. The other area is mitigating gaps in weather satellites. We were very concerned about this years ago because it would diminish the ability to get long-term and short-term weather forecasts, which are so necessary to protect life and property. As a result of being on the high-risk list and actions taken by the Congress, NOAA has launched a new satellite, and it's already operational, and it's producing better weather information than what we've had before. And DOD, which operates the other polar orbiting satellite, is scheduled to release a new satellite within the next couple of years. So this is back on track. Now, unfortunately, many of the areas on the 35 list haven't really changed that much since our last update in 2017. There have been some improvements, but not enough to change the rating against our 5 criteria for coming off the list, which are leadership commitment, the ability to have the capacity, the resources, and the people, have an action plan with milestones and measures, to do a monitoring effort, and actually demonstrate some progress in that area. 3 areas have regressed, which we're concerned about. One is NASA's acquisitions. Second is EPA's assessments of toxic chemicals. And the third is limiting the Federal Government's fiscal exposure by better managing climate change risks. Now, we're have added 2 areas in the update. One is government-wide personnel security clearances, as has been mentioned. We added that in January 2018, and at that time, the backlog was 700,000. So the backlog has been lowered to 565,000 now, so we're making some progress in that regard. Second, we're adding today is the acquisition programs at the Veterans Administration. There are outdated policies and practices. They haven't been able to save a lot of money. It's one of the largest procurement budgets in the government. Many purchases are being made under emergency situations when they should be able to more routinely identify what kind of medical supplies and services that they need for the hospital. So that's an important area. There are a number of areas that I want to single out for this committee that I think are very important. One is the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. The multi-employer portion of that pension system is likely to be insolvent by 2025. That means about 11 million Americans will only be able to likely receive $2,000 a year for a pension. I mean, this is not adequate, so that's a big problem. Second is the Federal role in housing. Finance, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are still under Federal conservatorship from the global financial crisis. Ginnie Mae's portfolio now is over $2 trillion. FHA portfolio is $1.2 trillion. A lot of lending now is made by non-banks, which are not very well regulated. And all the risk has moved to the Federal Government. 71% of the loans now for individual mortgages are supported by the Federal Government, either directly or indirectly. Cybersecurity needs to be addressed. We did a special update last year, and we testified before 2 subcommittees of this committee on the urgent actions that are needed to be required in that area. Veterans health care remains a problematic area, as well as a lot of improper payments across Medicare, Medicaid, Earned Income Tax Credit, and, of course, the tax gap, which is very significant. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering all your questions.
Thank you very much. Well, I will now yield to Mr. Huda for 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Dodaro, I want to ask you about one of those most important issues addressed in the GAO's high-risk report, climate change. Over the past 2 years, the U.S. Global Change Research Program released its 4th National Climate Assessment, which is the federal government's definitive statement on climate science. Volume 1 of the assessment confirmed that climate change is real, it is happening now, and humans are the primary cause. Volume 2 looked at the serious impacts of climate change and projected that rising temperatures, flooding, and extreme weather caused by climate change will result in economic losses of, quote, hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century, unquote. Mr. Dodaro, do you agree that climate change is occurring?
Our work relies on the Global Climate Change Research Program and the National Academy studies that have occurred that have concluded that climate change is having a significant effect on the economy and on environmental issues. And based on the result of that, that's one of the reasons we added it to the high-risk list. But our focus is on limiting the federal government's fiscal exposure to climate change. You know, since 2005, the federal government's had to outlay close to $500 billion to recover from disasters. We believe there needs to be more focus on adaptation and resilience building in the first place to mitigate these substantial disasters.
So talk about that in twofold. One, the cost of doing nothing, if you can talk a little bit about that,
Sure.
and the cost of actually doing something, because my sense is it costs a lot less to do something versus doing nothing.
The cost of inaction is sort of incalculable, but it's very high. Let me put it that way. The National Institute of Building Sciences has estimated that for every dollar spent on hazard mitigation, resilience building, it will save $6 down the road. It also estimates that for every dollar spent to institute new international building code requirements could save $11 down the road. So clearly, there's a lot of evidence to say that if you provide more money up front. We've seen that very recently in the hurricanes that happened in 2017. And you see the difference between what happened to Florida compared to Puerto Rico. Florida was well prepared. They had built a lot of resilience efforts in over the years. Puerto Rico really had not done that, and the devastation was, you know, almost complete in Puerto Rico, where Florida was able to recover, you know, with difficulty, obviously, but it makes a real difference. And with disasters predicted to be more frequent and more severe, the federal government needs to do this. That's why we put this on in 2013.
Okay. The Department of Defense has identified climate change as one of the top threats. And I'd like to ask you, how is climate change impacting our national security?
Well, it's twofold. One is that it is affecting DOD's own operations, both domestically and internationally. You know, a lot of their facilities are in coastal areas, and with rising sea levels, it poses difficulties. They've already had some experiences. The Hurricane Florence in 2018 caused over $3 billion of damage to the Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Hurricane Michael caused the Air Force Base down there over $3 billion in damage, so it's affecting DOD right now. The other aspect of it from a national security standpoint is how it might be changing global migration patterns and how droughts and other things might be destabilizing factors as it relates to the social and economic and political status of countries,
Right.
Which could then create some national security concerns.
Yeah, there are some suggestions that if we do not combat climate change at the current rate, that there will be 200 million climate change refugees by the year 2050, the largest mass migration of human beings since World War II. Let me ask you also about, as you know, we are the only country now not part of the Paris Climate Accord. and President Trump is apparently trying to set up a new White House panel led by a climate denier to counter the clear findings of the National Climate Assessment and National Threat Assessment. Do you think that the White House panel that denies climate change will help the federal government better manage climate change risk?
Well, you know, we do our work based on facts, and this group hasn't met yet, and I don't know really much about it, so I, reserve judgment until they produce something. The President certainly has the right to get advice from whoever he chooses, but there's a lot of studies already done by the federal government and the National Academy of Sciences, and but I'll reserve judgment until they produce something.
The gentleman's
For the
time
sake
has
of
expired.
America and the rest of the country.
Gentleman's time has
Thank you.
expired. Ms. Ice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I get to my questions, I'd like to just take a moment, Mr. Chairman, to personally say thank you. I think we had a pretty contentious hearing last week, and I just want to say thank you for your leadership and how you led this committee with fairness and reasonableness, and particularly as it related to Mr. Meadows. I just appreciate the way you handled that and really set a standard for this committee to deal with issues and not personalities, and I just felt it appropriate to publicly say thank you for your leadership in that regard. Mr. Dodaro, thank you again for your leadership as well. It's always good to see you. Appreciate all that you do for the American people. And as you well know and mentioned a while ago, this committee has been active in the past dealing with cyber issues and the OPM and Equifax and all these types of issues that we've had. In July of last year, we had a hearing with you about an interim high-risk update on federal cybersecurity, and we discussed in the nature of the cyber threat and the role of the U.S. computer emergency readiness teams. Just curious how that is going, if we're seeing improvements.
Yeah, I'd like to bring up Nick Marinas, who's our cybersecurity expert in that area. We still, there's a lot of room for improvement in this area. I'm very concerned about it. The actions might have been being taken, but they're not being addressed with a sense of urgency I believe is needed. But Nick can give you details, Congressman.
Okay, Nick.
Mr. Congressman, I think we would say that, as mentioned in our update last year, one of the 4 challenges that we highlighted was the important role and responsibility that the Department of Homeland Security has for organizing federal government efforts to protect their systems from cybersecurity threats. And we have seen some progress, for example, in addressing many of the recommendations that we've made. We've made nearly 3,000 recommendations over the last 10 years related to cybersecurity issues. We've seen that number come from 1,000 down to 700, but that still represents a very substantial amount of work that has to be done.
So what is the holdup? Who best answers that? I mean, what's going on? 700, like you said, is still a lot. What's the issue?
I just don't think there's enough management attention at the top levels of the departments and agencies of the federal government and across federal government to deal with this. There are a lot of plans that are put in place, and I want to commend the administration. They've had some national strategies, but there's no detailed implementation plans of what kind of milestones. When are we going to have these fixed? How can we tell if we're making progress? What are the resources needed in order to address these issues? I put cybersecurity on the government-wide high-risk list. First time we ever said anything government-wide in 1997. I mean, I've been on this quest for a long time. We've expanded it to critical infrastructure protection, as the Chairman mentioned, electricity grid, the markets. I mean, we have a big issue, and Congress also needs to pass comprehensive privacy legislation, which we've recommended as well. But the federal departments and agencies, year after year after year, there's same material weaknesses in their information technology systems. Now, a lot of this is a millstone around their neck is a lot of legacy systems. Of the $90 billion every year spent on IT, 75% of it goes to support legacy systems. I mean, some of these systems have been around since the 60s and 70s, and so they inherently have vulnerabilities that address them. So we have to replace the legacy systems. This committee's had some leadership in that area, and the modernization fund, now they have working capital funds with the intention of replacing legacy systems. And this committee has been focused on trying to make sure chief information officers have the proper authorities.
Well, and I share your concern. We have Fort Gordon, the Cyber Command headquarters in our district, and this become a huge issue to me as well. Regarding a little different, the IRS, and dealing with so much sensitive taxpayer information, what's the latest on that front?
You know.
With respect to the taxpayer information,
Well, and the cybersecurity issue, the threat that's there.
we continue to, with respect to IRS's own systems, we continue to see deficiencies as we do our annual evaluation of their financial statement activities. And we recognize that taxpayer information represents a very important element in performing IRS's mission. It's personal information about every individual, and so it represents a significant risk. And so it does require IRS to be very careful with the actions it takes with respect to that data.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Hindsight, thank you for your kind words, and I really mean that. Mr. Dodaro, I'm going to ask you a few questions. GAO is an extension of Congress. You are Congress's investigative arm, is that right?
That's correct.
And we rely on you to do a thorough and detailed reports and investigations like the one we are discussing today. But your work, and by extension, our work, is frustrated when you do not get the cooperation you need. So I want to ask you about multiple refusals by the Trump White House to respond to GAO's legitimate requests. I have a letter here that was sent from the General Counsel at GAO, Thomas Armstrong, to the White House counsel, Don McGahn. This letter was sent on May 9, 2018. It says this, and I quote, "I write to express concern about the policy of certain White House officers regarding communication with the Government Accountability Office. Specifically, I understand that attorneys from your office and the National Security Council will not respond to inquiries or otherwise engage with the GAO staff during the course of our reviews. This approach represents a clear departure from past practice," end of quote. Mr. Dodaro, I've been on this committee for 23 years now, and I've never seen a letter like this. Why did your GAO send this letter?
Well, typically our work involves examining government programs and agencies, and generally we get good cooperation in conducting about 800 audits a year for the Congress. Historically, from time to time, we have to contact the White House in a few instances. And generally over the years, historically, while we didn't always get cooperation from the White House staff, we at least were able to have good communications with them. In this case, they were clear from the beginning they weren't even going to talk to us about these issues. And so we were very concerned that we were not at least having lines of communication where we could try to work out some accommodations. Now, since we sent the letter, we've continued to have conversations with them, and we've made some headway in dealing with the National Security Council. We actually have a meeting next week to talk to them about a current review. We're looking at the International Atomic Energy Administration. And so, and a couple other instances, National Security Council is agreed to give us some information. But the White House Counsel Office has not. We'll continue to talk with them on an as-needed basis going forward, well, and enlist the support of Congress.
Let me show you another example. Last month you issued a report that I requested with Representative Speer. You reported that President Trump spent $13.6 million of taxpayer money in just his first 4 trips to Mar-a-Lago. However, in that same report, GAO also said this, and I quote, "We contacted White House counsel's office in April of 2017 and January of 2018 to solicit information from the Executive Office of the President related to coordinating travel for the President and any costs associated with White House staff traveling with the President. As of January of 2019, the White House had not responded to our requests for information. Is that what your report said?
Yes.
You also issued another report I requested on security protocols at Mar-a-Lago. Your report said GAO contacted the White House counsel's office in May of 2017 and January of 2018. But, and I quote, as of January 2019, the White House counsel's office had not responded to our requests for information. So GAO tried to reach the White House for almost 2 years about these reports and received no response?
That's correct. Now, what I also, though, did with the, I asked the teams to make sure we sent the draft reports over there, once we completed our work at the agencies, and we got a lot of the information we needed from the agencies. There are two parts of this. One, the White House is not taking advantage of the opportunity to give us their perspective on these issues and any relevant information. But even though they didn't give us information, I made sure they had an opportunity to comment on the draft reports, and thereby giving them a last chance to give us additional information if they, felt compelled to do it. And they did. They received the drafts. They took custody of the drafts, but they didn't provide any comments on the draft reports. But I didn't want them surprised. We're going to follow our procedures and be fair and nonpartisan in our approach. But we did not receive any information.
Did that surprise you?
Yes. Although, in all fairness, I mean, we've had problems in prior administrations when it comes to the White House. I mean, it was just a unique set of situations there. But what surprised us this time was not even want to have discussions. In the past, we've at least had discussions. Sometimes they've been contentious discussions. But we usually are able to work through things. But in some cases, the White House didn't do it. I mean, our most famous instance is when we actually sued Vice President Cheney to get information years ago. Now, we didn't prevail on that, but these things occur. But at least in that case, they were talking to us. In this case, there hasn't been any meaningful contributions. Although I am, as I said earlier, pleased that we've, at least with the National Security Council, because they have responsibilities now for coordinating cybersecurity. So if we can't get information from them about how they've taken over the responsibilities from the cybersecurity coordinator position that was eliminated, we're not going to be able to inform the Congress on how this administration is clarifying its roles and responsibilities in cybersecurity. I will be very concerned about that.
Okay. Since President Trump took office, about how many times has GAO requested information from the White House counsel's office?
5 times, 5 different audit engagements.
And as of today, has GAO received information from the White House counsel's office in response to any of those requests?
No.
Very well. My time is up. I yield now to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, have previous presidents traveled as well?
Yes.
Yeah, many times back to their hometown or wherever. The chairman talked about 13. I think the figure he gave was 13 million that President Trump has spent traveling to Mar-a-Lago. Did you have any idea how much President Obama spent traveling to Hawaii?
We have those figures that I could provide.
How about President Bush when he went back to Texas?
I'm not sure we did Bush. I know we did Clinton's.
Clinton when he went to Martha's Vineyard?
Pardon me?
Clinton when he traveled to Martha's Vineyard? You probably got President Clinton when he traveled there?
We had a request to look at, he had a trip to Africa, years ago. So it's different kinds of trips, but I'd be happy to provide all those to the committee.
The perception is that this is the only time it's happened, that someone traveled to their home or vacation spot. Previous presidents have done this time and time again.
That's correct, and we've done studies on most of the
Can you define high risk for me? What is, when you say high risk, define what that is.
We have published criteria we put out in 2000.
Give me the-
which
give me
we
the
vetted,
shorthand version.
But it's basically, you mentioned one of the elements we consider is more than $1 billion at risk.
Right.
But we also consider whether or not there's public safety, security issues, national security issues, homeland security issues, the potential impact on the economy. And so there's a lot of qualitative factors that we consider as well. We also consider whether the area is already receiving attention or not. And we try to focus our list
improvement, yeah.
on improvement,
Sure.
but focus attention on areas that are not getting a lot of attention.
Not getting a lot of attention, still faulty, haven't improved. Tell me those, I think you said there were 5 or 6 that have been on the list since 1990. So
Yes.
since you started this thing, some people started there and they ain't ever got off.
That's correct.
And who are those agencies?
The ones I can recall off the top of my head, and I'll get the complete list, is the Medicare program, tax administration. Issues have been an issue, both from an initial standpoint of the tax gap as well as now we added identity theft concerns. DOD weapons systems are on the list, and the other two are DOE, Department of Energy Contract Management,
Yep.
and NASA.
Okay.
Acquisition Management.
Those are the 5 I had, but the first 2 are the ones that I think jump out to me, because you got the IRS, which just about every single American has to interface with, particularly this time of year for most families, and then you got Medicare, which is pretty darn important as well, and they've been on the list forever. And we got some folks in the Congress who want a big expansion of Medicare. In fact, they call it Medicare for all, and yet there's all kinds of improper payments and all kinds of problems, and that's been the case since 1990, right?
There's been issues, yes. That's why they're on the list. Exactly right.
And what about the IRS?
Well, the IRS...
This is largely the tax gap, right? People owe taxes, they aren't paying them, and
yes.
money due to the United States Treasury.
Yeah, absolutely. The current estimate of the gap between taxes owed and taxes paid is about net tax gap of $406 billion. That's an annual figure. So I've been very concerned about that. We think IRS...
What's the improper payment level? I'll come back to the IRS.
Yeah,
What's the improper payment level on Medicare?
It's $48 billion, $48 billion for this last fiscal year.
You're talking $500 billion, right?
Well,
when you add those 2 together.
When you add all the government-wide, it's 100.
I'm just talking about these top 2 programs.
The top 2 programs are Medicare and Medicaid.
I'm talking about the IRS and Medicare, two that have been on the list since 1990, the tax gap at the IRS and the Medicare faulty payments. Those 2 total up to $500 billion.
Yes. No, you're right. Yeah.
That's significant.
Yes.
All right.
It's material.
I got to run to the floor and
It's
give a
material.
speech, but I wanted to just get that in. If I could, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back, and Mr. Comer's going to set in for us. Thank you.
All right, fine. Who's next? Before I leave, I've got to go to the floor, too, to speak on H.R. 1. Mr. Dodaro, I will be back, and I'm going to ask Ms. Hill, our Vice Chair, to take over from here, all right?
Okay.
But again, I say to you, thank you very much, and hopefully you'll get the kind of cooperation that you need to do your job. We don't want to be paying people who can't get the information they need to carry out their job. That's all they're trying to do. With that, we will now go to Ms. Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. I'm concerned that the VA is failing to make progress on reforms that are desperately needed to better serve our veterans. Today's report finds that these problems start at the top. Your report cites, and I quote, leadership instability at the VA as a major risk factor. As of last July, the positions of Secretary, Undersecretary for Health, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Information Officer, and the Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Community Care were all vacant. Mr. Dodaro, or whoever you designate, how has unstable leadership impacted the VA's ability to serve veterans?
Yes, I've been joined by Ms. Nikki Clowers, who's our health care expert, but I'll take a first shot at that. You know, since we put the VA on the high-risk list, I've met with 3 different secretaries, Secretary McDonald, Shulkin, and now Secretary Wilkie. So you've had, and we put them on the health care in 2015. So that shows you at the very top of the department how much turnover there's been there, and you mentioned problems throughout the department. As a result of that, we really, the VA to this day does not yet have a good plan for addressing the fundamental causes of why we put them on the high-risk list. They're working on it. They have a modernization approach. I've met with Secretary Wilkie. He's brought us his top people in and told them to work with our people, which I've said we will provide them as much help as we can to do that. But it's prevented them from dealing with some very serious underlying management challenges of accountability, oversight, updated policies and procedures, good training programs. They don't have good resource allocation issues in a lot of cases. So it's been a significant problem. Nikki, you want to?
I would just add to what you were saying, Representative Kelly, that the vacancies still remain a problem. There's about 12 senior leadership positions that remain vacant as of February. And when you have those vacancies and not clear policies or clearly defined roles and responsibilities for those in acting positions, it can cause confusion or for activities not to move forward. And we've seen that in some of our work, such as suicide prevention, outreach, where when there was vacancies in those leadership positions, efforts stalled.
So there's been a confirmed secretary for the last few months, but you're still citing leadership problems. What do you think that's about? Is just not enough time to get things in order, or?
Well, I would say, first of all, VA has some of the most serious management challenges in the Federal Government. And, we look across the entire Federal Government. And so the Secretary, no matter who it is, how well-intentioned that person will be, it's going to take time to address these issues. So I think you have to give the current Secretary some time. I've met with them, or people are working with them. I'm hopeful in this case we'll see progress, but it'll be some time before they can right the ship there.
One thing I'm particularly concerned about is IT, because I was a ranking member with Chairman Hurd last year on the IT subcommittee, and your report says the department has had 4 different CIOs in the last 2 years. According to the report, the frequent turnover in this position raises concern about VA's ability to address the department's IT challenges. What should the VA do to fix this persistent leadership problem?
Yeah, well, they have I believe they have a confirmed CIO now in place, recently, so that's a good step. But they need to fix a lot of their fundamental IT problems over there. They got a huge contract in place now to produce electronic healthcare records that can be comparable with DOD. We've been tracking this whole electronic healthcare record situation for 20 years over there, and VA and DOD still don't have either good systems themselves or the ability to share records between the 2 agencies. So if somebody leaves active duty service, their record doesn't go immediately to VA. You have to sort of start over, and this is a huge problem. This is expected to take many years to get these systems in place. So they're going to need stable leadership over there, better disciplined management practices and IT best practices. That's why I've offered to have our experts explain to them what kind of best practices that we've seen that they should put in place over there. So I'm hopeful they'll be able to do it. But they have one of the largest IT budgets in the government. They got about a $4 billion budget, as you know, in information technology, and so they need to have the right kind of workforce over there and the right kind of systems and processes in place.
I was going to ask you, are you
The gentleman's
looking
time has
at
expired.
the issue, and you apparently are.
Yes.
So thank you.
Yeah, we'd be happy to give you more details.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dodaro, I'm going to focus my questions on oversight of food safety. As more and more food is imported from abroad, do you anticipate more strain on customs and border protection as it enforces regulations on goods flowing into the country? Because when we talk about national security, obviously there are many of us in Congress, apparently not a majority, that are serious about border security. But one of the aspects of border security and national security that we fail to hear a lot about is our food supply. There's no greater issue to our national security than the need to have a safe, abundant supply of food. So I guess, what do you see in the future with respect to strain on border security?
Yeah. Well, the food safety has been on our list for a long time. Our system that we have now is very fragmented. There are about 30 different laws, 15 different federal departments and agencies that have responsibility for food safety, FDA and USDA being the two most important areas over time. And there is no comprehensive government-wide plan. Imports have grown dramatically over time, particularly in seafood areas, but about 60% of fruits and vegetables right now are imported as well. And that's only on a trend to continue in the future. And I think, the impact as it relates to the Customs and Border Patrol is they're a part of this system. But actually, I think from their standpoint, the other big issue that's on our high risk is medical products and food safety. 80% of the ingredients for prescription drugs come from foreign sources, 40% of finished drugs. And that's where we're having a lot of problem with fentanyl and other areas. So both food safety, as you're appropriately pointing out, but also other safeties of prescription drugs, medical devices, and others. So we're in a global marketplace now, and our systems were set up for domestic production, domestic oversight. So we've been working with the Congress for a number of years to now get the agencies more focused on other countries' systems as a means of trying to make sure that there's at least first line of defense there, and then we can also do our part to handle these areas. I'm very disappointed in the progress that we've made in the food safety area. You continue to see thousands of people who have foodborne illnesses every year. Many people die in the year, and recently there was the big recall of blood pressure medicine because of problems in production in China and India. Most of our prescription drugs come in from those two countries.
I believe President Trump has proposed consolidating all the food safety efforts under one agency. Would that correct the problem with waste of duplicate programs, or would that, how would that affect?
Yeah, well, we've called for such comprehensive reform in the past, and actually, based on my discussions with OMB, they were informed by our work in this area. Now, obviously, a lot depends on exactly how that's done, how it's implemented, and a number of areas. But there needs to be, at a minimum, a government-wide comprehensive plan.
Right.
And right now, the FDA and agriculture and these other agencies share a little bit of information, but it's on a situation-specific issue.
You're exactly right. That's been my experience
It's
dealing
not
with
a
the FDA and the
comprehensive.
USDA. They communicate a little bit, but not a lot.
Yeah, and they have very different approaches that they take to food safety. And so, our goal, we've been pushing for a reorganization for a while, but at a minimum, we need a government-wide plan. There used to be a Food Safety Council, but that hasn't met for a number of years as well. So that's a problem. And Mr. Gaffigan here, Mark Gaffigan, is our expert in this area. Let me just ask if he wants to add anything.
I would just say it's going to get more complicated. I was just at the Ag Forum last week, and they talk about our population getting close to 9 billion people by 2050 and the need to come up with that food. FDA and USDA are the two main agencies. They talked about having currently 17 different MOUs just to try to coordinate on. And one of the reasons it's going to become more and more complicated is the use of technologies. We're going to start seeing gene-edited beef, talking about those things. And there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty about that. And it's a global market. Other countries are doing different things. And we sort of need to get our act together, try and make sure there's some regulatory certainty so we can meet that need for safe, reliable food.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Raskin from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dodaro, welcome. You run the Supreme Audit Agency for the U.S. government, which is a $4 trillion enterprise, one of the most complex institutional entities on earth. Your high-risk designation program identifies government programs that have unique vulnerabilities to waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. And in 2018, you added the personnel security clearance process to your high-risk list. The GAO's report states, and I quote, "A high-quality personnel security clearance process minimizes the risks of unauthorized disclosures of classified information and helps ensure that information about individuals with criminal histories or other questionable behavior is identified and assessed." Now, I just want to ask you a few obvious questions first. Do you think that a high-quality security clearance process should identify concerns about a candidate's suitability before they receive classified information?
Absolutely.
Do you think a high-quality security clearance process should assess whether an applicant is susceptible to inappropriate influence or blackmail from a foreign government or another third party?
Yes.
Why is it important that investigators and adjudicators assess these concerns before a security clearance is granted to an applicant?
Well, it's very important because once a security clearance is granted, it's not updated until several years later. So you're entrusting that person to protect the information at the appropriate level, whether it's secret, top secret, there can be compartmentalized secret information.
And what kind of things could happen if security clearance is granted to someone who really shouldn't have it?
Yeah, well, you've seen episodes of that with Edward Snowden and other people. I mean, a lot of the secrets can be unveiled to the public. There's also possibilities of putting people at risk at the intelligence communities and law enforcement agencies. I mean, there's a lot of potential problems that could occur. That's why we put it on the list, because there was such a backlog. You know, it used to be, I mean, after September 11, 2001, more things became classified, and most recently more things are becoming classified. So the government really didn't adapt to having a better infrastructure to do security clearances. I might note also I've been joined by Kathleen Barrick, who's our expert in this area, so she'll help me answer some questions.
Okay, but you can choose who answers as you wish. But last week on February 28th, the New York Times reported that President Trump ordered John Kelly to grant Jared Kushner a security clearance. But based on the FBI's background investigation, career officials at the White House reportedly recommended against granting Mr. Kushner security clearance. And the CIA reportedly expressed concerns about granting Mr. Kushner access to the nation's most sensitive information. Do you know whether these reports are accurate?
No. We've not looked. We typically do not look at individuals and the clearance decisions. We look at how the process works.
Okay, and we cannot gauge the veracity of these claims either, because President Trump and the White House are withholding this information from our committee. When the GAO investigates whether a process or program is functioning properly, is it important for agencies and officials in the executive branch to cooperate with your investigation?
Yes.
Do you agree it's important for Congress to review how the White House conducts its security clearance process today in order to ensure that the system is functioning properly?
I think it's definitely within the Congress's oversight purview to do so.
Okay, well, I am with you because I'm very concerned that you are finding that our government-wide security clearance process poses a high risk is one that is going completely ignored by the executive branch of government. In fact, they're compounding the risk by overriding the procedures that are supposed to be in place. I'm very troubled that the White House and other parts of the administration have failed to provide us information about the process as required by a statute that was signed into law by President Trump himself. The committee must continue to pursue information about the clearance process at the White House and elsewhere in this administration. I think James Madison said it best long ago, which is that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. We need that knowledge in order to do the people's business. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Perfect timing. I'd recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, in the past decade, Congress has imposed many complex regulations on financial institutions with little regard to whether this is sensible, particularly for the small community banks and the credit unions. In February 2018, GAO reported that new financial regulations imposed costly compliance burdens on smaller community banks and credit unions. What steps should the financial regulators need to take in order to sufficiently address these challenges, particularly with the cost of the regulations that ultimately the customers or consumers are going to pay for?
Yes. Yeah, we've done work looking at the compliance burdens, particularly for community and small banks. I've been joined by Mr. Lawrence Evans, who heads our financial markets and community investment work. He can give you details.
Yes. Thank you for that question. One of the most important things regulators can do is rigorous cost-benefit analysis, including retrospective reviews. And we've leveled a number of recommendations militated toward ensuring that we're quantifying where possible, and we're doing everything in our power to ensure that we can right-size regulations where appropriate without losing effectiveness.
Give me some examples, like, well, pick Dodd-Frank, some of the regulations that they had back when the TARP fiasco was going on.
That's right. So, you know, some of these regulations are subject to the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which requires cost-benefit analysis before they promulgate the rules. Also, there is the AGRIPA process, which requires a retrospective review. So this will allow you to right-size regulations appropriately if it's done well.
And how were these presented to the banks? In other words, what form did that take to say that they could save X dollars if they did this?
So I think that's a more complicated question. Typically, when this analysis is done, there is a notice of proposed rulemaking or some type of a vehicle for banks to discuss issues that they have, and then that is considered as they attempt to finalize the rules.
Yeah, one of the things, Congressman, we were required to look at all the rulemaking under Dodd-Frank. And so one of the things that we identified was that a lot of the financial regulators are not required to follow OMB guidance on cost-benefit analysis, number one. And so we suggested they have a more rigorous cost analysis benefit that would follow the best practices in that area. Secondly, there wasn't as much coordination among the financial regulators as there needed to be in order to address this issue. So those were two things up front before the original regulations will be put in place. Then what we found is after the regulations were put in place, they were slow to look at it, how is it actually working? Because you can do a cost-benefit analysis up front, but you make assumptions and you have certain things, but it's different from what it might play out in reality once the regulation is in place. Yes. So both things are important.
CRA is a good example. A lot of banks, Community Reinvestment Act, where the banks wanted to invest, wanted to help the communities, but they had no guidance. Right. And they didn't want the hammer that was brought down. The other thing was the cost of compliance where banks, they couldn't afford to buy another bank in a smaller community because it was going to mean a whole new team of regulators to interpret the regulations that were put on them. So I would just ask you as you move forward to work toward that end, giving the banks definite things to work toward, concrete measures, so that it's not out in the hinterland, so they don't know how to enforce it.
Yeah, no, that's a point well taken, Congressman.
Thank you all for coming. I yield back.
Thank you. I would like to recognize Ms. Wasserman-Schultz from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Dodaro, good to see you. Glad to be able to have an opportunity to have some dialogue with you. It was a privilege to do that when I oversaw your budget as the Ledge Branch Chair. I want to continue with Congressman Raskin's line of questioning, because in your report, you indicated a government-wide security clearance backlog of 565,000 investigations. And your report also identifies lack of quality measures as a risk facing the government-wide personnel security clearance process. What quality assessment standards currently exist for background investigations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We've been reporting for the last 20 years on the need to improve the quality of background investigations supporting security clearances. And most recently, in 2010, we recommended that the executive branch develop measures to assess the quality of how agencies are doing in terms of performing investigations and documenting them. In the years since, the executive branch has taken 2 important steps to get there, but they haven't yet reached that goal. They developed, as you mentioned, these quality standards for assessments. These are really kind of guideposts that tell agencies, here's the sorts of things you should be looking at when determining whether or not an investigation is complete. And then they also developed a reporting tool for agencies to report that information through the Performance Accountability Council. What's missing, though, are those metrics to really assess how well are agencies doing in terms of meeting goals and developing high-quality investigations. And we continue to urge the executive branch to develop those.
Yeah, I think the issue we pointed out is you have good standards, but you don't know whether they're being followed or not. And so unless you measure how well they're being followed, you really don't know.
Okay. And that sort of begs the continued question that has arisen. If there are standards that have been established and strengthened on your recommendations, the recent media reports that indicated that members of the Trump administration, including Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, were able to obtain security clearances against the recommendations of White House staff, presumably using those standards. That's troubling because obviously the White House is supposed to set an example for the rest of government to follow, and your report outlines ways in which the administration is already failing to ensure that there is background clearance quality. Mr. Dodaro, could you share with us how granting a security clearance to an official where there were credible concerns about their ties to foreign nationals, you indicated that that would be a concern in answering Mr. Raskin's question, how would that impact our national security potentially?
Well, I mean, the whole point of the background investigations is to ensure that the wrong information doesn't fall in the wrong hands. So it's very important. It can compromise national security in a lot of different ways by, making sure that people can understand the government's, processes and controls and informations that would enable them to get in a, potential advantage of dealing with our, whether it's an adversary of the United States or even an ally of the United States. So this is very important that only the right people in the government have access to the highest sensitive, most sensitive information.
So, in your opinion, could the President's overruling White House security clearance personnel's recommendations impact the quality and integrity of a national security background check?
I don't have enough facts about that situation. We haven't looked at it to opine on that issue.
Okay. The fact that bypassing, let me just ask you another question. So would it be appropriate for an individual to bypass the recommendation against a security clearance from security clearance personnel?
It depends on the facts and circumstances associated with the decision. There's a part of the process that's called the adjudication process, and it's up to the person who's responsible for the adjudication to take the results of the background investigation and make a decision whether to grant the clearance or not. In some cases, they may or may not agree with the investigation that's in place. So it's a very facts and circumstances
And that's why
decision.
this committee under Chairman Cummings is trying to get information from the White House, which they have not yet sent, because we do need to get to the bottom of how those security clearances were granted, because as you said, there is a potential risk to our national security. Isn't that right?
I think it's well within Congress's right to ask questions and get the facts associated with the situation.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gibbs from Ohio.
Thank you. Mr. Dodaro, just to follow up on the security clearance. ultimately, the President of the United States, doesn't he have final authority to grant or deny a security clearance for a White House employee?
I'm not sure we haven't looked at the legal authority of the President in this regard.
Because my understanding, former President Clinton created a process issuing security clearances for White House employees by executive order. So maybe there's been some kind of precedent set there. I don't know.
Yeah, we've never looked at the security clearance process in the White House, either under past administrations or the current one.
Okay. I did have quite a few questions about food safety, but my colleague from Kentucky did an excellent job, and I was really impressed with your knowledge on answering those questions. Looking through your report here about the U.S. Postal Service, you talk about the $3 to $5 billion loss every year, and we all know that first-class postage is dropping because the stuff's done email and everything, but their third class, or the bulk stuff, isn't growing because all the shipments from the Internet. But then also, we all about the health care benefits to retirees. What do you see as their biggest challenge or the biggest adding to their deficit?
Yeah. Their biggest problem is the business model is really broken. And the first-class mail has always been their most profitable line of business. And that has declined. It went down further during the Great Recession that we had in 2009 or whatever, and really hasn't come back yet or not. And they haven't been able to control their costs. So they have a structural problem with their labor costs and other costs and not enough revenue to cover it. And as a result, they haven't been able to make payments into the retirement health care program. Now, for the first time, they're starting to draw down on the fund that they paid. So eventually, when that money gets drawn down for retirees' health care benefits and the health care benefits of their current workforce, there's going to be a real issue at that point. But right now, you don't have a sustainable business model with appropriate revenues and expenditures. I mean, they were intended to be a government corporation, to be run like a private business, but that model is not what's happened.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to get clarification on that because I hear from some of my constituents in that area that they're blaming it more on the health care retirement benefits is really their problem.
That's a symptom of the problem. I mean, their liabilities are almost twice their revenues. They're unfunded liabilities. That's included or whatever, but that's not, that's part of the solution.
Okay.
And we've suggested you could smooth out those payments over time a little bit better, but that alone is not going to fix their issues.
Okay. In previous years, the GAO has reported that the PBGC has not properly managed its investments. Has the agency corrected its policies and fully benefited from the growth in the stock market in recent years?
Mr. Charlie, come on. I'll bring up our expert in PBGC. I'm very concerned about the multi-employer pension program, as I mentioned in my opening statement. I mean, that's projected to be insolvent by 2025. And if that happens, PBGC estimates they'll only be able to pay benefits to, there's about 11 million people covered by that benefit of $2,000 a year. I mean, that's not adequate pension by any stretch of the imagination. Charlie can talk about their investment policies, Congressman.
Hey, microphone.
There are two big programs within PBGC. There's the single employer program and the multi-employer program. They have different structures. The single employer program actually collects assets when a company is bankrupt and the pension goes to PBGC, so they have those assets. The single employer program is actually doing much better. It's actually, I believe, in surplus as of 2018. So they have been able to take advantage of the stock market as well as other things to get to that situation. The real problem, as the Comptroller General mentioned, is the multi-employer plan program. And now the multi-employer program is a different structure. They don't collect assets from pension plans. The triggering event that the multi-employer program pays becomes operative on is when a plan becomes insolvent. So there aren't any assets there to, at least for PBGC to gain market.
Just quickly, do you have any recommendations at GAO about how to maybe resolve some of this issue, or?
Yes, we have a number of results. There needs to be a new premium structure that's risk-based over there. the PBGC board should be expanded, because right now it's just the heads of 3 or 4 different departments and agencies. There should be some outside people involved, experts in that area as well over time. And the Congress really needs to address the multi-employer pension program. I've sent special letters up. Congress took action in 2014, but it didn't completely solve the problem.
Gentleman's time is
outside.
And I can submit for the record all our detailed recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. I'd recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. I want to ask about one of the most important issues addressed in GAO's high-risk report, and that is climate change. Over the last 2 years, the Trump administration released the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is the federal government's definitive statement on climate science. And Volume 1 of the assessment confirmed that climate change is real, it is happening now, and that humans are the cause. Volume 2 of the assessment looked at the serious impacts of climate change and projected that rising temperatures, flooding, and extreme weather caused by climate change will result in economic losses of, quote, hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century. In fact, according to the New York Times, these prospects include major hits to GDP, up to 10%, droughts and reduced crop yields, and other issues, destruction of infrastructure due to rising sea levels, rebuilding power grids wiped out by storms. We've seen this even on a small level in Puerto Rico. Some of these costs, especially with reducing farm yields, represent permanent losses to the economy, to the United States economy. Mr. Dodaro, do you agree that climate change is occurring?
Our work relies on the global climate change assessments that are done, as well as numerous studies by the National Academy of Sciences, which have concluded that climate change is producing economic and environmental risks to the government and increasing the federal government's fiscal exposure.
So you believe climate change is real?
Well, that's one of the reasons we added it to the high-risk list in 2013. Now, our focus in the high-risk list is on limiting the federal government's fiscal exposure.
Got it.
And
do you agree that the United States could face huge costs as a result if we fail to act right now?
Definitely.
Okay.
Sorry,
because I
all right, go ahead.
time. President Trump's own Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, provided a national threat assessment to Congress in January that identified climate change as a threat to our national security as well. Global environmental and ecological degradation, as well as climate change, are likely to fuel competition for resources, economic distress, and social discontent through 2019, this year, and beyond. How is climate change currently impacting our national security?
Well, there are the direct impacts on the Defense Department right now. You saw last year with the storms in North Carolina and in Florida, Tyndall Air Force Base, Camp Lejeune, both had damages over $3 billion and need to be repaired. There's other infrastructure, particularly along coastal areas where sea level rise is changing. And the impacts on the Defense Department also extend to their international installations around the world. So it's both domestically and internationally.
So we're seeing already, as you mentioned, already existing costs in the billions of dollars due to the Department of Defense because of climate change and the impacts of climate change. But rather than trying to slow down climate or mitigating its impact, it seems as though the administration right now is ignoring its own scientists, national security professionals, and economists who warn that the continued increased flooding, extreme weather, and temperature increases will be extremely costly for the federal government. Mr. Dodaro, what steps would the GAO recommend that the White House take to show leadership in addressing these issues and saving our next generation?
Yeah, our recommendations extend in several different areas. One is to have a comprehensive national strategy. Federal government needs to provide leadership in this area. Many of the vulnerabilities are decisions that are made at the state and local level, building codes and other issues. We've also recommended that the federal government find out ways to provide better climate science information to state and local officials so they can be on an actionable basis. The federal agencies need to prepare. Federal government is one of the largest property holders in the United States. The flood insurance program is not on a fiscally sound basis. It's not actuarially sound. It's also on our high-risk list. Crop insurance. So we made a a number of recommendations in that area. I can give you a complete list for the record.
And I would just like to submit that it truly does not seem as though the track record is showing up that there is any desire in the executive branch to address climate change. And we have to reiterate that Congress, and we have to use our powers here so that Congress and this committee, particularly with oversight, take action to address this clear and present danger to the United States. Thank you very much.
Yes, and along those lines, we do give credit to the Congress for passing the National Disaster Recovery Reform Act in 2018, which allows funding now to be set aside for resilience building and mitigation, and to give state and local governments funding for building code reforms. So that was a good step Congress has taken.
Thank you so much.
More needs to be done, though.
We agree. Thank you. I recognize Mr. Grothman from Wisconsin.
Okay, I'll lead off a little bit of a statement on the concerns about climate change and that sort of thing. I realize you don't have a choice, apparently, to bring things in or investigate things or make statement on things when individual congressmen ask you to do things. But without going into it depth, if you Google it, the science or the opinions on climate change vary a great deal. You know, sometimes you talk about saving money, which is good. You know, we don't want waste in Medicaid or Medicare or anywhere else. But as far as doing wide-reaching things because of climate change, which may or may not be true depending upon what you Google, I think has the potential to kind of discredit your agency in the eyes of some, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I always kind of think of GAO fighting waste or fraud or something that we're all on the side of the recommendations. And when you begin to make recommendations based on what some people think about climate change and other people don't think about climate change, I think it kind of hurts your agency a little, though you might not have a choice in it. Now I'll go on and want to talk about the tax laws a little bit. You have made recommendations, I guess 103 recommendations to the IRS since February of 2017, and most of those recommendations remain open. Could you give me some summary of the recommendations you have, or major recommendations that you believe nothing has been adapted on?
We have recommendations in the IRS, both for the IRS itself as well as for the Congress in those areas. But I would say, with regard to your statement, Congressman, we're focused on limiting the Federal Government's fiscal exposure. Since 2005, the Federal Government has spent nearly $500 billion to respond to major disasters. We're not suggesting that there be steps made in dealing with greenhouse gas emissions and all those things. Our focus is on fiscal exposure to Federal Government, which we think is our responsibility in GAO, and we've got a good basis for doing that. So I'll let Chris talk about the IRS.
Yes, sir. Congressman, as the Comptroller General mentioned in his earlier testimony, is that when you have a $400 billion annual tax gap, we've been focusing, as well as IRS, on how do you reduce that tax gap? How do you make sure that we can, because all you would need is—
Define the tax gap.
Tax gap is the difference between what IRS actually collects and what is legally owed. And so this is, Congress has already established through law what should be paid, and this is actually what comes in. And this is a net, this $400 billion. So this is after enforcement actions may have taken place. So this is a big deal. Not only is it foregone revenue, but it also, if you're a business and you're fairly and accurately paying your taxes, it puts you at a competitive disadvantage if your competitor is not paying, his or her taxes. So we've been focusing on opportunities to reduce the tax gap. The point here is that you would only need 5, 10, 15% reductions, and you're in effect funding another cabinet department. So you could really make a big difference there. The strategy that IRS needs to put in place is threefold. One is that they need better enforcement, and that is it needs to be better targeted. They need to know return on investment of their various strategies that they have in place. We've had recommendations in place that they need to do a better job on that. Second is that they need to have much better customer service, is that most people want to pay their taxes, and they want to pay it accurately. A lot of times when they don't, it's because they've made an honest mistake, and that if the IRS makes sure that they have good customer service, they can help on that. Their telephone service has improved markedly in recent years because Congress gave them more financial resources to do that, and because IRS is putting in a better service strategy as we've been recommending. And then the third thing that needs to be dealt with is obviously the complexity of the tax code. It can be very difficult for people to understand what they need to do.
Do you think part of the problem is when we put dollar-for-dollar credits in there, it encourages people to do wrong things? I mean, you put a wrong number on your tax return. If the marginal rate is 27%, maybe it affects you, 27 cents on the dollar. But when you have credits in there, I think it encourages people to intentionally do things wrong. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, we haven't actually looked at it from that angle, sir, and it's an intriguing way to think about the issue. But there are two aspects of what you're raising, I think, that are important. One is that for many of the errors that may be made by people, the actual dollar amount may be relatively small for those individual errors. Obviously, cumulatively, it can be huge. But the individual errors, if they're small, yes, sir.
I just want to get one more question here on Medicaid before things end. I was recently down at the border, and the customs people were concerned of all the Medicaid cards they saw people coming back across the border down south to Mexico had. In other words, people who were here illegally with Medicaid cards. Is that something you've addressed, the degree to which we are giving Medicaid benefits to people who are not citizens?
Mr. Dodaro, the time has expired, but you may answer the question.
We have not focused per se on that issue. One of the things, though, that we've suggested that CMS has not, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies, has not looked at beneficiary eligibility determination since 2014 when the Affordable Care Act went in place. They're going to start now in 2019, but for these several years, nobody's been looking at the eligibility determinations for individual beneficiaries, and that needs to be looked at.
Good. Customs thinks it's a problem, so thanks.
Thank you. I just have to say that as a Californian coming off of the most deadly fire season in our state's history, that science is science, and I think that that's something that we should continue to respect in this chamber. With that, I'd like to recognize Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Dodaro, welcome back. You're a frequent flyer to this committee, and I just want to say I hold you and your staff in the highest regard in terms of the work that you do on our behalf. I want to follow up on Ms. Wasserman Schultz's questions and other members' questions about security clearance. So we've been worried about this for some time, as you know. It's been a frequent topic of discussion at this committee. I know going back to the Navy Yard shootings where we had an individual who should not have had security clearance was able to perpetrate those crimes. I do want to drill down a bit on Mr. Kushner, though. And, I know you look at the system and not individuals, but we have an individual here who he had dozens and dozens of contacts with foreign governments and foreign officials. And yet, when he had to fill out his disclosure to get his clearance, he forgot. And he forgot about meetings that he had just had weeks and months before he applied for his clearance. So he had dozens of meetings with foreign officials, Russians in particular. I think he, frankly, you don't have dozens and dozens of meetings and then just forget about it. I think he actually misled people in getting his security clearance. And then on top of that, his own refusal to disclose, the White House also engaged in reinforcing or abetting him in his cover-up. The White House transition team, basically Hope Hicks at the time, said, no, it never happened. There was no communications between Mr. Kushner or any campaign and a foreign entity during the campaign. That was on November 11th. Again on January 13th, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, he gave a timeline of meetings between General Flynn at the time, who was the National Security Advisor, and Ambassador Kislyak from Russia, but he never mentioned that Mr. Kushner was in the meeting, so they gave a very selective disclosure there. Again on January 23rd, 2017, again, Mr. Spicer disclosed phone calls with Mr. Flynn and the Russians, but left out Mr. Kushner and did not disclose that Mr. Kushner was at the meeting at the Trump Tower. So, and it goes on and on and on. There's February 14th, February 16th, February 20th, where the White House says there was no contact at all. And yet, later on, there was pressure put on Chief of Staff John Kelly to basically give him the security clearance. Here's where it gets really interesting. Now we have multiple whistleblowers who have come forward to the committee and indicated to us that Mr. Kushner is leading an effort to transfer nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. And the details of this, I'll just give it to you really quickly. Brookfield Business Partners buys Westinghouse Electric for $4.6 billion. And they're trying to get the contracts in Saudi Arabia to build these nuclear plants, along, if they get the approval from the government. What they're trying to do as well, they just bought a partnership share in 666 Fifth Avenue, which is owned by Mr. Kushner's family, and it's in dire financial shape. So the same company that's looking for the technology transfer for the Saudis is invested in Mr. Kushner's family's building at 666 Fifth Avenue. So, I mean, if you're ever looking for a smoking gun on something, and your people are really, really smart, I mean, all of them, but it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure this out, that there's a problem. And it just goes back to the decision that was made to give this individual a security clearance. And the total disregard for national security and for the interests of this country being exercised by this individual in this White House. So I hope you look into it. We're going to look into it, that's for sure. It is a disgrace that this is happening and that we are allowing an individual with these obvious conflicts to continue to be involved as a special envoy when his own personal interests are obviously overriding the national security interests of this country. Thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dodaro, thank you for your service to your country, sir. You have struck me as such a candid and intelligent man, and your staff must be brilliant. One of the most difficult jobs that perhaps exists in this federal government is to try and keep this thing under control regarding spending. So thank you for your very sincere effort. I have important questions regarding significant services to many, many millions of Americans, Medicaid and Medicare. But before I get there, let me ask you, you refer to process and studying the process in the interest of fiscal stability and efficiencies for the federal government. That's your job. The process and differences between White House clearance processes and federal agencies clearance, security clearance process. There's a difference, is there not?
Quite frankly, Congressman, I don't know because we never looked at the White House security clearance process.
Are you familiar with the fact that the White House conducts a suitability review and then they can receive a favorable or unfavorable adjudication through another series? It's different for a federal agency?
Yeah, I just don't have that
information. Well, let me just share that according to my understanding, the President has the ultimate authority to grant or deny security clearance. So are you aware that members of Congress have access to highly confidential data and security clearances?
I would assume so, but I've never looked at that process.
We do. Don't quote me on this, but according to my memory, somewhere north of 40 congressmen, either prior to office or while in office, have been convicted of felonies. So let us move on, please, to the people's business. According to your knowledge, sir, I'm moving, if you need the appropriate staff member to Medicaid here. I'm very concerned about it. Last year, the federal portion of Medicaid spending totaled nearly $400 billion. Additionally, 9.8% of federal program spending of $36.2 billion was attributed to improper payments. Now, one of our major missions here is to control waste, fraud, and abuse, mismanagement of monies, and you and your staff are brilliant and dedicated to this effort. As the Medicaid program continues to expand and grow, I'm increasingly concerned about the program's integrity. In fact, auditors in my home state of Louisiana have recently identified as much as $85 million in improper payments. What's the status of CMS's initiative to reduce improper payments based on your recommendations?
They're starting to take some action. They have a strategy that they put in place, but quite frankly, a lot more needs to be done. The $36.7 billion that you mentioned in improper payments is only one component of the components of improper payments at Medicaid. The other component, Congressman, is the managed care portion, which is about half of the Medicaid spending. Nobody's auditing that area as well, and we've recommended they do that. I've talked to Darryl Papera, your state auditor in Louisiana, and work with the State Auditors Association to try to get state auditors more involved, and the federal government should support them. The other component, the third component, is beneficiary eligibility determinations. That has not been done by CMS and administration since 2014, when the Affordable Care Act put in place.
Federal legislation fix that?
Pardon me?
In your opinion, could Federal legislation?
Yes, I think there ought to be Federal legislation to give the state auditors a role.
I have limited time. I'd like to move on to Medicare. Both of these programs is crucial for so many millions of Americans that these programs have long-term sustainability, and this is my concern. Medicare is a critical lifeline for almost 58 million elderly and disabled beneficiaries and makes up to 17% of total federal spending. It's been a high-risk program since 1990. In my remaining 41 seconds, please advise America, what can we do as members of Congress to comply with your recommendations, sir, and save these vital and important programs?
Yeah, first of all, Medicare is on an unsustainable long-term fiscal path. By 2026, the trust fund for the hospital insurance portion will only have 91 cents to pay on the dollar. We have a number of recommendations where payments could be equalized between outpatient and a doctor's office service and outpatient at an integrated consolidated facility at a hospital. Right now, they're paid on different rates, even though you get the same service. There are certain cancer hospitals that have been grandfathered in to get higher payments than other areas. We have a long list of recommendations we think could help, but this needs congressional attention.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield.
Thank you so much. Ms. Presley.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro. I appreciate the GAO's comprehensive data collection and your insights today on the various high-risk areas within the federal government. In April 2020, the census will move to a digital platform to provide online access for more than 100 million housing units across the country. Although an online system will undoubtedly improve the efficiency and accuracy with which the federal government can collect much-needed personal information, it also presents substantial challenges for many congressional districts like the one that I represent, the Massachusetts 7th. It is one of the most unequal in the country, and I maintain that is because it is under-resourced, and that is because of undercounting, and the digital divide is still very real. Based on the latest census estimates, 63% of Mass 7th residents live in hard-to-count neighborhoods, a figure that is nearly on par with the 71% of people in hard-to-reach communities nationwide. Mr. Dodaro, would you agree that the intended goal of the census is to maintain a fair and accurate count of every person living in the U.S.?
Yes.
What factors, aside from limited to no Internet access, might make communities susceptible to undercounting, given the methodological changes in the upcoming census?
The response rate to the mail survey continues to be a problematic area. The response rate has gone from 78% in the 1970 census to 63% in the 2010 census, and census is currently estimating that the response rate will drop even further to 60%. So one of the things that's very important is the get-out efforts by the partnership efforts in the local communities to get people to fill out the form. They'll have options to do it in a digital way, but they'll have paper options as well. And so the main thing that could be done is a grassroots effort that Census is trying to work with state and local officials to get people to fill out the form. And that's a big effort. Chris Mim is our expert in this area. I'll ask if he has other suggestions.
And could you also just give your opinion as to whether or not this undercounting also contributes. Not only does it contribute to the under-resourcing and the allocation of federal funds, but does it affect redistricting and representation as well?
Well, it could, yes. Chris?
Okay. And what steps can we take to mitigate undercounting? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Let me let you go. Go on, Chris.
Come on, Chris.
We got 2 minutes and 26 seconds. Let's go. We're trying to be effective and efficient here. I'm sorry. Okay, let's go.
Ma'am, I'm not here to interrupt a member.
Okay. I'm a fourth Italian. We do that. Come on, bring it.
The key thing that Census Bureau needs to do on the precise issues that you're talking about is work with local communities, work with community organizations in those communities to build confidence in the integrity and the accuracy of the census. They hire partnership specialists that come from the communities that are sensitive to the types of issues that could result in an undercount. Even when they're doing the homeless count, they would look to get advocates for the homeless population that would know where the places are.
Let me ask a question. Given growing anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia, Wilbur Ross proposed that we add an immigration status question. This would be the first time in 60 years that question has been on the census. And how do you see that contributing to undercounting, given the fear that so many immigrants are living under?
We haven't looked precisely at that question, ma'am. That is the question of the citizenship question. What I can say is that what we have seen in past censuses and what concerns us about this is any late changes to census design always induce uncertainty and therefore risk. The census has to have hundreds of different operations come together perfectly at a precise point in time, once every decade. Any uncertainty on that is not a good place to be.
Great segue. So do you feel that you are well positioned and prepared to administer the census from an operations standpoint and from a staffing standpoint?
I'll let Chris elaborate, but there is risk at this point. The next 6 months is critical. There are hundreds of security weaknesses in their IT systems that haven't been fully tested. The census has had to scale back on its tests and only really done one test in Providence County, Rhode Island, when they had multiple sites. So there hasn't been enough testing. They're trying new procedures, and the combination of all these things leads to a risk, which is why we put it on the high-risk list. So there needs to be a lot more done.
Thank you. And I have 10 seconds left, and I'm just curious. Again, my district is one of the most unequal in the country, certainly has been impacted by mass incarceration. 1 in 4 in our households has an incarcerated loved one. Do you support incarcerated individuals being included according to their home address, not where they're incarcerated?
That's not something I'm saying. I know what that issue is. We haven't actually looked at that from a policy standpoint because it is a policy call, but we know it is an issue of some controversy within the Census Bureau, but we haven't looked at that directly, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Ms. Miller?
I yield.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for being here today and sharing your report with us. You know better than most the importance of ensuring our government is running efficiently and that we need to be good stewards of our taxpayer dollars. One of my goals in Congress is to make sure that government is accountable to the people it serves, and your report helps us show where we can improve. In your report, under retained areas, you highlighted the cost of funding our nation's infrastructure. As you are aware, our nation's infrastructure is in need of repair and improvement. Worn down, broken roads and bridges pose a safety risk for travelers across the United States. My own district experienced this in 1967 when the Silver Bridge across the Ohio River collapsed, killing 46 people. Improving our infrastructure ensures that we can connect our rural and urban areas and continue to get our goods and services across the United States. It also means economic development for the communities in our country. However, to ensure we repair and maintain our nation's infrastructure requires a significant investment. Given the cost of repairs and improvements to our infrastructure, can you elaborate more on your findings?
Yes. The Highway Trust Fund, for example, on surface transportation, has not been able to pay the annual amounts necessary to maintain federal investment in highway repairs, for example, since 2008. There's not enough money being generated through the tax on gas to be able to do that. So Congress has had to appropriate additional money. There's enough money been appropriated to provide funding to 2021. After that, there's a big gap
If you want to maintain spending right now, it's about $45, $50 billion a year. You'd have to have $158 billion to cover the 2022 to 2029 period. So the whole concept initially of our transportation system, particularly the highway portion, was it was supposed to be funded by users and to be self-sufficient over time. That's no longer the case. And so the Congress needs to deal with the financing aspect of it. Ms. Susan Fleming's joined me. There's also a standpoint of making sure that the investments by the state and local levels produce better results with a number of the discretionary grants and other money that's there. And she can talk to you about reforms underway there.
Okay, well, we need to fund our vital infrastructure, but according to the DOT, only 15% of the roads in California are in good condition, and they have the second highest gas tax in the country. Furthermore, about 20%, or $8 billion, of all federal gas tax revenue doesn't even go to the roads. Before we even go to the taxpayers and ask them to give their government more hard-earned tax dollars, we have to be sure every dollar is being used efficiently and effectively as possible. Are there other efficiencies and revenues that you think that we could use to fund infrastructure other than gas taxes?
Well, there's other recommendations that we have to make more efficient use of the money that's there, particularly discretionary programs given the state and local level. Susan can elaborate.
You know, I think it is a policy call for Congress about whether or not you want to increase revenues through additional gas tax or other sources. What we recommended is to spend the money wisely and efficiently. And we've applauded the fact that the last two surface reauthorization bills have required that the Department of Transportation move toward a performance-based framework. So basically ensuring that we are getting the best value for the dollars that are being spent. We're in the early stages of that framework. DOT has put out rulemaking, and now the states are in the process to establish targets and to evaluate performance. So we're optimistic that we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Also, I'd like to shift our focus to the Veterans Health Administration. As you are aware, in 2014, a scandal broke at the Phoenix VA where it was found out veterans were dying while they were waiting for care. We also found the VA was covering up its extended wait times. This is unacceptable and has since shed light on other problems that are facing the Veteran Health Administration. I'm very lucky in my district. We have a great veterans hospital, the Hershey Woody Williams VA Medical Center. However, I want to make sure all veterans across the United States receive good access to the care they've earned and deserved. What immediate changes need to be made at the Veterans Health Administration?
Ms. Nikki Clowers is our expert in that area. I'll have her respond.
Thank you.
Representative, one of the things that we've recommended for them to do is to look at their access standards that they have for the veterans and make sure that the access standards they have in place represents the full life cycle from when the veteran approaches the medical center for appointment to when they're actually seen, to determine how long that is taking, and then make adjustments based on that to ensure that they're getting timely access to the care that they need.
Okay, thank you very much.
I want to thank the gentlelady for her remarks on this issue. It's so important, and I couldn't agree more. Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member. Mr. Dodaro, thank you for being here today. And every single member of the GAO that's here today, we owe you a big round of applause. Thank you for your hard work. Digging into this kind of stuff, it's tough to do. It's hard work. Stubby pencil. Some might say bean counting, but some people would get offended by that. So I won't say bean counting, but you're in there digging out the details, and we have to have it. You know, the Army just recently went through its first audit. Its first. I think it's older than the nation, actually, the United States Army, and it's just gone through its first audit. So we need you. We're glad for you. We appreciate you. I served as the CEO of a healthcare company. We had about 1,000 employees when I left the company. And digging in, doing the Six Sigma, the lean analysis to find where we could make operations better was, bread and butter of our company. And so I'm especially interested in asking today about the VA. I'm also a VA patient and a veteran, and as a physician and CEO of a healthcare company, watching just the tragedy of the things that are happening at the VA breaks my heart. And so my first question is really just, as I understand it, you guys have made over the years, the 2 years that they've been on this list, 30 different recommendations for the VA to make changes. And I just wondered, what's their responsiveness to you on those 30 recommendations?
They're working on the individual areas. Ms. Nikki Claris can give you the details, but the responsiveness has been slow, and I'm concerned about it. As I mentioned earlier, I've met with 3 VA secretaries, Secretary McDonald, Secretary Shulkin, Secretary Wilkie. I'm encouraged by Secretary Wilkie's commitment to work with us in order to address not only our recommendations, but the underlying root causes of why they're on the high-risk list, and to develop a comprehensive plan for improvement. And we keep, finding the same problems over and over. The VA is on our high-risk list for three components: health care, disability claims processing, and now acquisitions and procurement of medical supplies and products that could be more efficient as well. They have a huge budget. It's not been for lack of resources that they haven't addressed these problems, in my opinion. But Nikki can tell you, we meet with them monthly to go over the recommendations, but they need a better plan. They need stable leadership. They have some of the most entrenched management problems that I've seen across government, and I've been around for a long time.
That's sad to hear, because they've been here since, I think, 1930. You'd think they'd get some of those business processes worked out. Are they allowed to do cooperative purchasing agreements like other hospitals in the country are, to band together with other hospital organizations and purchase in bulk?
Yeah.
They are allowed to do that?
Yes.
Okay. And they're just not? Or?
Come on, Michelle. She's our expert in acquisitions.
Awesome.
Now, this is Michelle Mack.
This is in my strength zone, so I'll go in the weeds for a second.
Strategic sourcing, I think, is what you're talking
Exactly.
about. And we've actually recommended that the individual medical centers do that in order to leverage their enormous buying power. I think part of it is a very decentralized organization, and each local medical center wants to buy what they want to buy for the clinicians at that medical center. So they've been a little slower to implement that for medical supplies, but for other types of supplies like some IT goods and services, VA has done strategic sourcing and saved quite a bit of money.
Okay. Well, what drives that decision-making in the hospital world outside the VA is hiring physicians, right? So if you're going to purchase a specific spine screw in order to get that surgeon to come work at your hospital, that shouldn't be a problem with the VA, I wouldn't think, but...
Well, what we found, Congressman, when they try to launch a purchasing program for medical supplies, surgical supplies, they didn't involve the clinicians as much as they should have in deciding what to purchase. And as a result, 20% of their purchasing items are still done on an emergency basis because they don't have a competitive process in place to buy in bulk, leverage their purchasing power. So they're revamping this again, and we'll see if they come up with a better approach.
Unfortunately, I think I'm out of time. I've got about 57 other questions, but I yield. Thank you for being here.
We're happy to follow up with you later, talk about these things.
Thank you. And you might have noticed that was not actually a mistake. It was really because I wanted to make Mr. Gomez, my colleague from California, wait, but you may now speak.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I always appreciate the extra 5 minutes I'll get at the end of this presentation. But before I go on, one of my colleagues was questioning your credibility if you bring up climate change or you consider climate change in developing the risk assessment. I just did a quick Google search and I looked up the Department of Defense 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap, and it says, quote, among the future trends that will impact our national security is climate change. So if the Department of Defense is looking at climate change, I think you're in good company, and I think your credibility is well intact. But I want to turn to the census. It's an important issue that's coming up, and you mentioned previously that the department only conducted a full operational test in just one city, Providence, Rhode Island, as you mentioned. And you also mentioned some concerns about the IT. It says the report states, I quote, "Not fully testing innovations and IT systems as designed increases the risk that innovations and IT systems will not function as intended during the 2020 census." What are the risks the census could face from a lack of adequate testing?
Yes, there are many. Let's have Nick, go ahead, Chris.
Sir, just to clarify your question, are you interested in IT testing or testing overall?
Testing overall.
Okay, testing overall is me. What the big risk there is, as we were discussing with the Congresswoman, is that this is a once-a-decade operation, and there are an innumerable number of procedures that have to come together, and if you mess it up, you don't have an opportunity to step back and say, okay, we'll do it again in another 6 months or so. So the testing needs to be done to make sure not just that individual programs work, but they also all work together under census-like conditions. That's the importance of doing it in different locations around the country, with different populations, with different census-taking strategies, to make sure that it will work when you actually go live, because there is not a do-over.
But it could affect the quality and increase the cost.
Absolutely.
What are the risks of not having tested in the rural areas, remote communities, and other types? Same thing, you might not have it just function correctly?
That's correct. And it's difficult to count in rural areas to begin with.
It's a separate set of challenges there, sir, is that, the key to the census is counting not just each individual, but counting them at their usual residence. And so you need to make sure that you actually locate them where they are living. And in some of the most rural parts of the country, different address conventions, P.O. boxes as opposed to actually street numbers. The second thing there is that they're going to be, the census takers will be using handheld computers, and that if you have internet connectivity problems in some of the more rural areas, that can compromise both the quality and the cost of the census, as the Controller General mentioned.
And just also, you just mentioned that cutting the tests to save money would actually end up costing the U.S. government more in the long run. Is that correct?
It potentially can, because, I mean, we're a very diverse country, as you know, and just testing in one location doesn't really give you a full range of tests. Chris mentioned the internet connectivity. It's variable across the country, particularly in certain areas, and so that's going to be a problem. So we're very concerned that the testing hasn't been as robust as you would want to have, particularly when you're introducing new concepts into the census.
Do you have a rough estimate of how much it will cost if things are delayed or we don't hit our...
No, well, the current estimate is $15.6 billion, and there's some contingencies in there. I'm not sure, there'll be another estimate coming out from the Bureau soon. We've looked at the estimate. The original estimate that was made several years ago we found was not comprehensive or reliable enough. The current one is pretty good.
So given the reductions in testing, is there a risk that the census will not be ready to run an accurate and secure 2020 census?
There's risk at this point. The next 6 months are critical. I can't give you a final determination, but there's certainly enough risk to be concerned.
Are we further behind today from the 2020 in preparation compared to the 2010 census?
Yeah, I'd like to tell you that the censuses in the past have run like clockwork, but they haven't. And there's been problems with almost every one. I've been involved since the 1990 census.
And I noticed you put it on the 2009 high risk.
The only reason it comes off is because it actually gets conducted. I can't tell you, but I do think, given the new innovations that they want to put in place, that I do think they're behind where I'd like to see them be in terms of testing.
Yeah. So for my next 5 minutes, I'm kidding. I'm here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Mr. Zarro, welcome back. I think this is one of the most important hearings our committee has every year. And hopefully we can try to double down on working with you to implement the recommendations contained in your annual report. We were talking, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez was talking a little bit earlier about climate change, and good for you in making it one of your high-risk categories. I think the science is quite clear. I heard a colleague earlier indicate that it was questionable. Maybe for him, but not for the rest of the world. There's a very strong consensus in the scientific community that it's real. And as you point out, if you want to argue about the theology of climate science, go ahead. But real communities in real America, and for that matter around the world, are looking at real costs and trying to figure out resilience and retrofit to protect themselves from the clear consequences of rising sea levels, changing temperatures, crop changes, and even what constitutes temperate zones for growing food. And so I absolutely salute GAO for doing that. It's not a new item for you, but it's imperative that you be immune from any political pressure in calling it like you see it. Another subject that you and I have talked about, this committee has worked with you very closely on, is, of course, IT, information technology, and the vulnerability of the federal government, and legacy systems, encryption, how we procure and manage our IT assets. And I was looking at your report this year, Mr. Dodaro, and just looking at the cyber part of the IT subject, you had 700 GAO recommendations to agencies addressing cybersecurity risks that have not yet been implemented. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
And of those, 35 are priority recommendations that you say should receive particular attention from heads of key departments. And of those 35, 26 have not been implemented. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So why haven't they been implemented from your point of view? What's going on that we're not making the kind of progress we should be?
I'm concerned that it's not a priority for the heads of the departments and agencies, that there's not a full understanding of the extent of the vulnerabilities there, and that they're not held properly accountable for those areas. Even where Congress has expressed concerns in the OPM situation, for example, they still haven't responded to all of our recommendations in the area.
Even after the breach?
Even after the breach.
That compromised 24 million Americans' data, yeah.
Right. And so I think Congress should provide more rigorous oversight and top-to-the-top leadership of the agencies in order to deal with this issue, because year after year we keep finding the same problems, as well as the Inspector Generals. Now, some of it's part of the not replacing the legacy systems, but again, there needs to be some urgency there as well. So, I mean, Nick Marinas, our expert, might have other reasons, but from my standpoint, that if you don't have the leadership and the top direction, you're not going to solve this problem, because there are many other competing problems.
Yeah, two quick things, Congressman, that I think you're very familiar with. One, leadership gets very interested in cybersecurity after the incident, unfortunately.
Although not in the case of OPM.
Well, and then what I would also say, too, is that we also see the average tenure of CIOs generally be around the 2-year point, too. So I think that's another challenge, too. You may have committed leadership for a certain period of time, but generally they don't stick around too long.
So, as you know, we work with GAO on the quarterly scorecard for compliance with FTAR, which is sort of the framework legislation governing a lot of this. Let's make sure that we need your help and input in making sure that we're adequately addressing the cyber part of it, and we'll be glad to talk to you further about how we do that.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. You meant the Conley-ISA bill, didn't you?
Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. You're always welcome in this committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Cloud?
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate this topic. This seems to me like this is exactly what this committee should be about. And so appreciate you and your team being here. And appreciate you preparing a report on waste, fraud, and abuse, mismanagement in government. It's essential with us having a $22 trillion debt and continuing deficit spending that we begin to figure out where the problems are, and you seem to outline a lot of them for us. I appreciate seeing that some items have come off the list and others have improved. I think that is the goal. It's kind of like the endangered species list. The goal is to rehabilitate and get them off the list eventually, and in a sense, that's what's happened in some areas. But there's some areas that have been there since the 1990s when we first started doing this. DoD weapons systems acquisitions, NASA acquisition management, DEO's contract management for nuclear, National Nuclear Security Administration, and Office of Environmental Management. There's a mouthful for you. Enforcement of tax laws. Can you explain some of the challenges and why we're not seeing any movement on these?
For a number of years, you know, we've looked at, let's take the DoD weapon systems. First thing was to get better management practices in place. You know, we looked at how the private sector develops technologies, and what we found was that DoD, in many cases, was not identifying the requirements up front, stabilizing the requirements, not maturing the technologies before they go into production. So right now, DoD has, based on our recommendations and congressional actions, particularly the Acquisition Reform Act of 2009, imposed in their requirements best practices, but they're not being followed in all cases. Now, when they are being followed, and based on our recommendations, in the weapons systems area, DoD saved $36 billion. But in most cases, they're not following the best practices and implementing them properly as well over time. And as a result, you get a fact where there are cost overruns, there are schedule delays, and ultimately, less functionality gets delivered to the warfighters in the end. So there's an ultimate price to be paid in this area. So part of it is not going through a disciplined process on a consistent basis.
Right.
Same thing's true in the Department of Energy. For example, 90% of the Department of Energy's budget goes to contractors. In a lot of cases, I think the contractors have had the upper hand on DOE, and there hasn't been enough independent cost estimates that have been done over time. When these projects change at DOE, they can change by a decade in terms of schedule delays, and the cost can increase by multiple billions of dollars. And so we've got them to implement now better cost accounting practices. Excuse me. And actually, we showed an improvement in the DOE contracting area. NASA had been making better progress, but they've regressed. We've downgraded them in their leadership commitment. I've met with NASA administrator. The new human spaceflight programs, Congress isn't getting the full cost information. It's not transparent over time. What needs to be done? Their portfolio of programs is having more cost overruns and schedule delays. The James Webb Telescope, for example, is years behind, billion dollars over budget. And so they put together a new action plan now, but it needs to be implemented over time. Medicare continues to be problematic, $48 billion in improper payments last year. They're getting better attention to this area. They've increased their staff focused on it. But it continues to be very problematic. We've made recommendations that they seek legislative authority to do more prepayment audits, because unless you can stop these improper payments up front, it's too hard to recover the money afterwards. And so we made a lot of recommendations, but these are big problems, and we've seen incremental improvements, but there's more needs to be done.
Yeah, if I may, I only have 30 seconds left, which is kind of indicative of today's discussion, that we have 34 major programs that you've identified as high risk in just a couple hours to cover them all. Do you think it would be helpful, if I could ask a couple questions to get them in, do you think it would be helpful for this committee to take each one up in a committee hearing?
Absolutely.
It seems if we're going to give oversight to it, that would be essential.
Absolutely. And where we've seen progress, congressional hand has been at play.
Right.
So it's instrumental to making these problems. I'm happy to come back and our team talk about each of these areas individually.
And then one of the criteria that is on this list is that it has to be in danger of losing $1 billion, because I guess anything less than that just doesn't count as government waste anymore.
Yeah.
But is that a helpful metric, or what metrics should we be looking at?
Well,
the gentleman's time has expired, but you can answer the question.
That's the one quantifiable measure we use, but we have many qualitative measures, the impact on the economy, on public safety and health, the impact on national security, and other factors. And so many of the areas are on there not solely because of the dollar exposures, but because of their importance to the American people.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, but appreciate you being here, you and your team. Thanks.
Thank you both. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. My questions are follow-up around the VA issues. It's a huge issue in my district. It's personal for me. I'm concerned that the VA is failing to make progress on long overdue reforms that are necessary to provide the best possible health care to more than 9 million veterans. The administration has said that veterans' health is a priority, but this report suggests that actions haven't exactly matched up with that. The report finds that many of the VA problems stem from a lack of clearly established goals. Your report says, quote, though the department took steps to establish offices, work groups, and initiatives to address its high-risk designation, many of these efforts are either in the initial stages of development or resources have not been allocated. And this is a yes or no question. Mr. Dodaro, is the VA moving fast enough to address its high-risk designation?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Why do you believe that resources are not being allocated more quickly?
Well, they basically have difficulties with their resource allocation process, which is one of the reasons we put them on the high-risk list. Now, Ms. Clowers, who's our expert in this area, can elaborate.
Just briefly.
Certainly. As the comptroller said, in terms of capacity, this is the area that you mentioned. There's a number of activities that are ongoing, but they really just started in the last 6 months, and we need to watch them mature to make sure they have the right resources, both people and attention on these issues.
Okay, great. And is this something that you believe our committee needs to be involved in addition to?
Absolutely.
Okay. So given the lack of an adequate action plan in your report, it states that the VA's action plan did not include all goals and substantive actions taken. What are the risks of a subpar action plan?
The risks are the problems will continue, which is what we've seen. Our reports and a report of the Inspector General from VA continue to find the same type of problems regardless of what we look at.
Great. The GAO also reported that the VA's Veteran Health Administration lacks sufficient data to monitor whether veterans are getting timely access to the Veterans Choice Program. Today's report states that the veterans who were referred to Veterans Choice Program, quote, could potentially wait for care up to 70 calendar days if the maximum amount of time allowed by VA processes is used. Mr. Dodaro, is it true that wait times this long exceed the maximum limits under the law?
Yes, the maximum limits under the law are 30 days.
And what do you believe needs to be done around this?
We've made some recommendations. They need to clarify their wait time rules. They need to train their people properly, and they need to follow up and monitor effectively to make sure that's being adhered to. They also need to change their processes. One of the things they did with the Choice Act is they involved an intermediary between VA and the eventual providers, which just built in an additional layer of bureaucracy and delay.
Thank you. The VA estimates that every day 20 veterans die by suicide. Some veterans have committed suicide at the very VA hospitals where they've come to receive care. Each of these deaths is a tragedy, and last year the VA declared that suicide prevention is its highest clinical priority. Just yesterday, President Trump announced a new task force to provide recommendations for this ongoing tragedy. But the high-risk report makes it clear that this is an additional problem. Do you agree?
Yes, we issued a report. Nikki can talk about it, but you know, they're trying to right the ship now in that area and make it a priority. But there was funds that were unspent for a period of time back, and but it needs continued attention.
That's why I want to. What I want to highlight is that there's the social media and the media outreach campaign around veterans suicide prevention had a massive decline, including the VHA's contractor for social media content around this issue dropped from 339 pieces in 2016 to just 47 pieces in 2018, a decline of more than 85%. And as many of my colleagues know, 339 pieces of social media is not a lot in general. And additionally, the GAO found that the VA expected to spend just $1.5 million out of a $6.2 million obligated for suicide prevention in fiscal year 18. As of September 18, GAO found that the VA had only spent $57,000 of the obligated $1.5 million in outreach, making it unlikely that they spent much more. So today's report concludes that the VA's failure to do more aggressive outreach is, quote, inconsistent with VHA's efforts to reduce veteran suicides, which is the VA's highest clinical priority. Is that correct?
It is.
And what additional steps should the VA take to improve outreach to veterans and do a better job of preventing suicides?
One of our recommendations was for them to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the leadership office there. One of the contributing factors that we saw in the decline of the efforts was a gap in leadership. So the position for that office remained open for a number of months, and then they had an acting person in charge. And what VA told us was they didn't feel like they had the authority to move forward, and so you saw these efforts decline. The other recommendation that we made is for them to establish performance targets for their efforts. They do collect a number of metrics on their outreach efforts, but they lack the targets to know whether it's good or bad. So the contractor will tell them there's 20,000 hits on the website, but you don't know if that's what they wanted to achieve.
I know I'm over. Is there a timeline for these improvements? Because veterans are dying at a rate of 20 veterans per day from suicide.
VA told us they agreed with the recommendations and would implement them in 2019.
Thank you so much. Recognizing Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the report, and I want to talk about the $23 million that could be economically captured from flared gas. So, and this isn't about the environmental. There's lots of reasons we don't want to flare natural gas, right. But I think we can assume that this is associated gas associated with oil wells, because nobody's drilling a gas well to flare the gas. So one of my questions, this is one of the things, I've had this conversation, we've dealt with it a lot in North Dakota. So today, oil's trading at $56 a barrel. Gas is at $2.88, but just for simplicity, we're going to use $3 an MCF. And so a typical well in the Bakken is 500 barrels of oil, 500 MCF. And typical federal lease is 20% royalty. That's about right?
It depends, but yeah, it's in the neighborhood.
In order to capture that, if a well produces 500 barrels a day, 500 MCF a day, the royalty on the oil would be $5,600 a day. The royalty on the gas would be $300 a day. So in a month, it'd be $168,000 in oil royalties, $9,000 in gas. In a year, it'd be about just around $2 million in oil royalties versus $109,000 in royalty on gas. And the reason the gas is flared is because the federal government doesn't build the infrastructure to get the gas. So natural companies don't go to get it. But if you're losing 20%, whoever's drilling the oil well is losing 80%. And so they're making an economic decision to do that. And so, and I think, so if you shut down that oil well for a day because you have to, because the only way to capture the gas is to get a pipe in the ground, get a processing plant midstream or upstream, so you lose that 500 barrels of oil a day, and you turn the well back on the next day, you don't get the oil back then. You only get 500, if you shut the well down on Monday, you lose 500 barrels, but when you turn it back on Tuesday, you only get 500 barrels of oil again on Tuesday, right? I mean, they don't double, you don't produce twice as much on Tuesday. And one of the the reason I ask that is just purely from a revenue collection standpoint, you don't get the money back on the royalty for oil and gas till end of life of the oil well. So if you have to shut that oil well down for a month to capture the gas royalties, you lose all of the oil royalty at the same time. I mean, am I correct?
So I think you're as good a bean counter as we are, and following all that. But the point we're making in our report is the methane rule, the methane emissions rule, which BLM worked on for a number of years. And the point of that was to look where it was economically made sense, and you could bring in the technology to reduce the amount of emissions that were vented. So, for example, if you had leaks in the system, you would use the infrared technology to try to identify that. So I think that's what the methane rule is about, that we talk about in our high-risk report. And that rule was developed and finalized in November, I believe, and then later revoked by an executive order. And we felt that was a step back because it didn't, and was replaced by another rule, which didn't allow for that calculation. In other words, it just assumed that the cost, it was too costly to do it, whereas the rule prior had folks take a look at whether it was costly and made sense to do it. That was the issue around the methane rule.
But you're not putting the technology in. That, I mean, when you're, the premise is still the same. Every dollar you lose in gas at $3 an MCF on an associated oil well, there's a $56 barrel. I mean,
Oh, absolutely, and we know in the we know in the Bakken that oil is the name of the game. The infrastructure is not there, and in North Dakota, you know, there was a lot of initial boom from the fracking there in the shale, and that play, and the concern even in North Dakota was to figure out what they could do with the gas. And again, this is a rule that applies across the country. And where applicable, the idea was see if it makes economic sense, and we have the technology to try to reduce the amount of emissions. So it wasn't just in North Dakota, just across the nation.
No, and I understand. I mean, I understand that, but I think we're still talking about associated. I mean, regardless of whether it's here, or the Eagle Ford, or the Powder River, it doesn't matter where. I mean, when you're talking about gas in this context, you're talking about associated gas. And when you say when you say we have the technology, who do you mean has the technology? I mean, it's not the federal government.
No, it's the producer of the oil. It's the producer of the oil and natural gas, sure.
And the same, just one more on that.
Please go ahead.
And the same premise would, I mean, apply to that as well. I mean, if you're losing 20%, they're losing 80%.
Yeah, and I don't think that, again, I don't think the rule necessarily referred to the actual production. If there's no market for the natural gas, you're allowed to flare it, right?
Well,
to the associated gas.
There's a lot of reasons not to flare gas.
Right.
And there are a lot of reasons not to flare gas.
Right.
But I mean, when you're dealing with associated gas in an oil well, I don't think the economics is one of them.
Yeah.
Mr. Armstrong, I can tell your passion for this issue. It's understandable, but your time is up. We're going to recognize Ms. Norton.
We'd be happy to meet with you further to discuss it in our work.
I'm sure he'll take you up on that.
All right. I'll bring my calculator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, it looks as though the census is off to a very tough start. Major litigation involving citizenship status that could affect the census, I believe going to the Supreme Court, and all at a time when, for the first time, we will be taking the census online. That really would seem to me to essentially take you to redesigning how you do the census, but let me see if that's the case. Any idea of what percentage, what proportion of Americans will be going online to fill out their census form?
Ma'am, we'll have to, I'll have to get you that information. We'll get it to you right after.
I wish you would, because because when you consider that most people are used to the paper census, and you're having to prepare for online, I'm beginning to wonder about this census
Now, Ms.
in
Norton,
many ways.
If you don't respond on, or if people don't respond on the census, then they will get a paper form after that, and so they'll have the two options. But we'll get you the answer to the question you're asking.
Yeah, but I'm worried about those who do respond, and I'm worried about your testing and the delays, the compressed time there was for testing. Why was the time compressed for testing?
Initially, they argued that they had some budget issues. Now, the budget issues have largely been resolved. For 18 and 19, they were, they've gotten, in fact, they've got even more than what they were looking for. But there were some budget constraints in the early years.
Do you have enough funds to do the census right, Mr. Dodaro?
The Bureau believes that the funding that they have for this year is adequate.
I'm interested in whether the delays we have experienced will turn up or lead to problems in the census going forward. The end-of-end test, as it is called in 2018, did it meet its key milestones?
It met the key milestones, but it was reduced, ma'am, as you mentioned, in that the premise to your question. The biggest challenge that they face going forward is that they have all these various operations that have to come together and at precisely the right moment for a once-a-decade operation. And so, just like you're talking about with the internet option, anytime you're introducing new ideas and new ways, even when they make sense, such as like an internet option, it does entail a degree of risk. And so that's why throughout the decade you want to have a very robust testing process to make sure that you're testing the census under different conditions, different places around the country, different population groups, because you want to make sure that you're testing that captures the diversity of the nation.
Well, did you test it online? Did you test it with respect to paper ballots? Because it looks like there are going to be two censuses.
Well, there's the way to work, ma'am, is that at least under the current design, there'll be similar to the last census, there'll be a postcard that will go out ahead of time, reminding. In that case, it was just alerting people that in the 2010 census, alerting you that be on the lookout for your form. This time, it will tell you you have the option to answer online. For those that do not answer online after a period of time, and I mean just a matter of a couple weeks or so, then they will be getting the paper, and then after that is when the census takers will come if you have not done either online or the paper. The big challenge there is just because of all the concerns about even a reduced response rate overall, that it's going to require more hiring, more follow-up of the census takers, a population that may not be just because of survey fatigue and in other reasons may not be as willing to or able to respond to the census. So that's going to put an extra burden on what they call their non-response follow-up operation.
Surely it's hard enough getting people to respond once. When they may have to respond twice, I must say I'm concerned.
Well, the challenge there, ma'am, is exactly what you're saying, is that the Census Bureau is going to have in place, and they've been working very hard on this, is what they call the deduplication, and the risk that that one of us would respond on the internet and then try and respond on the paper. The Census Bureau has to have in place in order to procedures and automated processes to make sure that they can deduplicate, and they've been working very hard on that.
Right. My team also tells me, Representative Norton, that the Census Bureau estimates 45% of the households will respond online.
That's huge.
If that happens, that's one way to reduce the cost, because you won't have to send people door to door to do that. So we'll have to see what the actual experience is, but that's the current estimate.
Your report says, and here I'm quoting, that the 2020 census lacks a risk assessment and certain best practice and best scheduling practices. Now, given how you testified about what I will call the dual census, is there time to get to best practices to be assured that this dual way of doing the census will in fact work?
Yeah. And Ms. Norton, your time has expired, but gentlemen, please go ahead and answer.
The next 6 months are critical, Representative Norton, and that will tell you whether they're going to have adequate testing in time or not. We're concerned, but the next 6 months will tell the tale.
Mr. Chairman, if I could say so, I do think if next 6 months is when we're going to learn something that we need, perhaps in the next 3 months, another hearing.
I agree. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes and agree with my friend from Virginia, Mr. Dodaro. This is one of my favorite hearings. To your staff, I know you don't get acknowledged, in my view, nearly enough for the work you do, but I just want to go on the record and acknowledge that, in spite of your shameless comment to Mr. Connolly. So the Center for Disease Control has done a study on so-called diseases of despair. They're a very large problem in this country. And in relation to that, and we're going to have a hearing tomorrow that you will not be at, but Mr. McNeil will be here. Why, reading why you put our efforts in to prevent drug abuse, why did you put that in an emerging category? And I'd like to say, too, in our discussions with you and the Governor's Association, opioids, and the bills that we got passed on a bipartisan level, I was able to put 3 or 4 amendments in there with Republican colleagues about metrics and performance standards. We're spending $30 billion a year on this. It costs, just the opioid crisis, costs us $500 billion. The fact that this is emerging at the same time that we're in a bipartisan effort trying to assert ourselves in this raises large concerns for me. Could you respond to that, please?
Well, the fact that, one of the factors that we consider is public safety. And this is an area that is very concerning. It was mentioned earlier that there are 70,000 deaths from drug overdoses every year. It's 119 people a day. And the situation's getting worse rather than better despite all the efforts. For the last 2 years, until for 17 and 18, there was no national strategy. There was no official in charge of the Office of Drug Control Policy. So I became very concerned. I've held forums on this issue where we brought a lot of experts together from the provider community, from the treatment community, from law enforcement, and we talked about the challenges associated with this. So I think the challenges are huge. We're doing more work in this area, so we put it sort of in a category of, we're considering putting this on the high-risk list, and that we're watching it very closely. And if we think that like the national strategy, for example, our preliminary observations are it doesn't cover all the things you'd want to have in a national strategy. And our witness will talk about that tomorrow at your hearing. But we've already found some deficiencies in that national strategy that we think need attention. So this is a very worrisome area to people. As a parent and now a grandparent, I've worried about this with my own children going forward. And so I think it's deserving of special attention if it warrants it.
Well, we'll go into this more tomorrow, but in relation to previous administrations, going back through multiple presidencies, Republican and Democrats, we've put a lot of effort nationally at the state level, at the local level into this. The report that we'll talk about tomorrow is 23 pages, I think. There's only a page that refers to metrics and performance standards. I thought it was fairly appalling, having been involved in this field for some time. So it seems to be more than emerging. This is it was a crisis before. We've recognized this as a crisis since President Reagan was president. Sorry, Californian Freudian slip. What can we do, and more than the hearing tomorrow? We have plenty of performance metrics now. The public health system does, CDC does, but they're daunting to make sure that we're on top of this. And again, in context of a bipartisan effort, particularly on the opioid side, to intervene and support public health officials, it strikes me that 2 years and the lack of specificity on performance standards and metrics in reference to those that have been built on by previous administration is rather appalling and would make me think it should be high risk.
Yeah, well, again, we made this determination a couple of months ago before we saw the national strategy and had a chance to evaluate it. So the one thing I will tell you is that we don't normally have to wait a full 2 years for the next update to put something on the high-risk list. I put on a number of issues out of cycle to the high-risk list in this area. We have 30 open recommendations that need to be addressed in this area. And once we have some work underway, not only in the national strategy, but in a number of other areas, as soon as we finish this body of work this year, I'll make a determination of whether to officially add it or not.
Well, I look forward to having further conversations outside the committee on this. Some of those performance standards asked you and the National Academy of Sciences to help with best practices in this regard to make sure that the efforts we've made actually show real results as soon as possible, because the urgency of almost 200 people a day losing their lives speaks for itself.
I couldn't agree with you more, Congressman.
Thank you. Thanks again. Now I want to recognize Mr. Lieb.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. 18 years. That's amazing. I've only been here 2 months, and I just want to commend you for sticking around for 18 years to run the GAO. I really commend you.
Actually, this is my 46th year at
Oh,
GAO.
it's 40. They put 18 years.
No, I look younger.
Oh.
But
That's amazing. 46.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, congratulations. And I've only heard incredible things about you, your integrity, and I appreciate that service. So I'm really concerned about the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that it's not meeting its obligation. I think for me, I come from Michigan, And from the lack of response with the Flint tragedy that continues impacting so many children and families to this day, to the fact that I have some of the most polluted zip codes in the state of Michigan, from piping in the tar sands from Canada, and they produce the petroleum coke, and the coke carbon company dumped it on the riverfront. And as a former state legislator, trying to contact the EPA for some sort of response. And so when I read part of your report, you identify, and you used the word, I think, you identified that the EPA's process for assessing and controlling toxic chemicals as high-risk area, and that I think in there is quoted saying regressed, that the EPA's efforts have regressed over the past 2 years. And you should know this morning we just had a hearing on PFAS, and the fact that even then everybody recognizes it's dangerous, it's an impact on public health, we need to do something about it. But again, there seems to be a lack of action on the EPA. So I'm wondering, what is the IRIS program? What are some of the things that you're mentioning here? And if you can provide some sort of feedback to me as a legislator, what I need to be doing from my end to hold the administration accountable.
Sure. I'll start, and Mr. Gaffigan's our expert in this area. He can add. First, the IRIS program is the program EPA uses to assess the hazard assessment of the chemicals, and actually produces a toxicity estimate, a number. And that's then used not only by EPA programs and regional offices to then assess whether or not to regulate it and how to regulate it if they do. It's used by state and local officials and others. So it's really intended to be the starting process for assessing a chemical's capabilities. Now, one of the changes that we had recommended in the past that Congress has finally improved in the Toxic Control Substance Act to now require EPA, under the new requirements, has to approve a chemical in advance. Previous to that, they had to prove it was problematic, and so the burden is shifted. So the EPA needs to implement the TSCA requirements too, the new amendments to the law. But the IRIS program also is a starting point for that area. And we have a number of recommendations underway. They've improved the process, but right now they haven't been transparent in how many assessments that they're going to do and what's happened to assessments that were already through many parts of the process. In some cases, they've been in assessment in process since the 90s.
Yes.
And so it's not transparent enough, and it's not clear that how they're going to apply the resources necessary to do this. We labeled them as regress for two reasons. One, the leadership of EPA hasn't been as outspoken about this as a priority than the previous administration was. And secondly, they proposed budget cuts for the IRIS program. Now, Congress didn't go along with the budget cuts and kept the resources at the 2017 levels, but it's not clear how those resources are going to be used and how the assessments will be prioritized going forward.
So, is this about the lack of capacity? Or is it, when you say since the 90s, I've heard even other horror things of not being able to get something that is toxic on the toxic list for the EPA. Is it, because I think it goes beyond the capacity, it's also the will or some political courage. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Sure. I think, as the Comptroller General said, we felt they regressed in the leadership part of things. And so with we felt all along that there needed to be some congressional action to help improve the authorities that EPA had to do this. And so the 2016 Act did provide them that. And so we've been doing a series of work following how they're doing in the implementation. And we just released a report on Monday that really sort of highlights the importance of staying on top of the leadership and ensuring transparency throughout the process. Very simply, to take the IRIS program, in May of 2018, they had 20 chemicals on a list ready to go. They had talked, they checked in with the program offices. They all said this is what they still wanted. They had the resources to do it. They were told in June to hold up by leadership. They were told not to work on any of the assessments. In August, they sent out a survey to the offices again asking, these 20, do you still want them? Survey results said, yes, we do. The then leadership said, later asked, well, prioritize within these and limit, to 3 or 4. But they provided no criteria for the program offices to decide, well, how do we prioritize? Next thing they know, there's a list published in December, has 11 chemicals on it. 4 chemicals, which were on that list of 20, which were ready for peer review at stage 4, disappeared. There was no explanation as to what happened. And so that speaks to the lack of transparency, and that really comes from leadership. I think they have an opportunity to make decisions, but they need to be transparent about it. Otherwise, it raises the questions of why did this happen?
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. That's our last member who would like to speak. I want to thank you again for your fine work and all your staff work. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate you for the testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their responses. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is adjourned.